Tonight, several signals are appearing at the same time across the Persian Gulf, and none of them can be dismissed as routine. Commercial tankers are slowing, reversing course, or disappearing from public tracking systems as they approach the Strait of Hormuz. American aircraft and naval forces have struck dozens of targets along Iran's southern coastline, including radar sites, missile capabilities, command networks, and vessels operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Missile warnings have sounded in Bahrain and Kuwait, where American military forces are based. Oil prices are climbing again, even as governments insist that the waterway remains open. And behind all of this stands an agreement signed less than 1 month ago. An agreement that was supposed to stop the fighting, restore commercial navigation, and create 60 days of space for diplomacy. President Donald Trump has now described that arrangement as effectively over. Iran says Washington violated it first. Neither side has formally abandoned every channel of negotiation, but events on the water and in the air are moving faster than the diplomats. The question is no longer whether the ceasefire is under pressure. The question is whether anything remains capable of containing what comes next. Welcome back to Global Frontline Analysis. If you prefer to understand why international events are happening rather than simply hear that they happened, you are in the right place. Subscribe for careful analysis of military conflict, diplomacy, energy security, and the decisions being made behind the headlines. And as we move through this crisis, remember that several important claims from both governments remain contested. What is confirmed is serious enough. What remains uncertain may be even more consequential. The immediate chain of events began during the night of July 6th and the early hours of July 7th, when reports emerged that commercial vessels had been struck near the Strait of Hormuz. One of the most seriously damaged ships was the Al-Raqayyat, a Marshall Islands-flagged tanker carrying Qatari liquefied natural gas. A projectile reportedly struck near its engine room while the ship was sailing close to Oman. Fire broke out, creating initial fears that the vessel and its cargo could be placed at greater risk. Later assessments indicated that the cargo remained secure and that the immediate danger of an explosion had decreased. But the ship required assistance and could not simply continue its voyage. A Saudi-flagged crude tanker, the Wedian, was also damaged. A third vessel, the Liberian-flagged Cyprus Prosperity, was identified by the United States as another target in the same sequence. Together, the incidents represented more than isolated damage to 3 ships. They created the appearance of a coordinated effort to punish commercial vessels, using a route near the Omani side of the strait, a route supported by Washington and rejected by Tehran. CENTCOM publicly attributed the attacks to Iranian forces, while Iran did not issue a straightforward admission of responsibility. Iranian messaging instead focused on the claim that ships had ignored instructions governing passage through the waterway. That distinction is important. It gives Tehran room to deny that it is attacking international commerce indiscriminately, while still signaling that vessels refusing Iranian arrangements may face consequences. Qatar condemned the attack on the LNG carrier, and maritime authorities raised the assessed threat to shipping. What remains unavailable to the public is a complete independent reconstruction, identifying which Iranian unit, weapon, launch platform, or command authority was responsible for every strike. But the pattern, the location, and the official warnings surrounding the attacks made a confrontation increasingly difficult to avoid. What made the incident especially dangerous was not only that commercial vessels were hit, but that they were hit near the most strategically sensitive maritime passage in the global energy system. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, heavily monitored, and bordered by Iranian territory to the north and the Omani peninsula of Musandam to the south. Shipping lanes run through a confined space, where merchant vessels, naval patrols, surveillance aircraft, drones, and coastal missile systems operate in close proximity. Before the war, roughly 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products moved through the strait, representing about 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. Around 1/5 of international liquefied natural gas trade also used the route, much of it originating in Qatar. The world can replace some of those volumes through pipelines, strategic reserves, alternative suppliers, and longer shipping routes. It cannot quickly replace all of them. This is why a projectile striking a tanker near Oman can affect fuel prices in Asia, manufacturing costs in Europe, aviation expenses in the United States, and government budgets across the developing world. Hormuz is not simply a regional passage. It is a pressure point connecting military decisions in the Gulf to household expenses thousands of miles away. The American response arrived rapidly and at a scale far beyond a symbolic warning. On July 7th, U.S. Central Command announced that American forces had struck more than 80 targets in and around southern Iran using precision-guided weapons. According to CENTCOM, the target set included Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar installations, command and control networks, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 small boats operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Those boats matter because Iran's maritime strategy does not depend on matching the United States ship for ship. The IRGC Navy is designed around asymmetric pressure. Fast attack craft can operate in groups, approach larger vessels from multiple directions, lay mines, carry anti-ship weapons, support boarding operations, or force commercial captains to alter course, without requiring Iran to risk its most valuable conventional warships. Coastal radars help detect and track movement. Missile batteries extend the threat beyond visual range. Command networks connect those systems into a larger operational picture. By targeting several components at once, Washington was not merely retaliating for damage already done. It was attempting to weaken Iran's ability to repeat the attacks and to demonstrate that interference with commercial shipping would bring costs against the infrastructure supporting that interference. CENTCOM's description of the operation is official, but no complete independent assessment of the damage has been released. Hitting a target does not always mean destroying it, and Iran has spent years dispersing military equipment, building hardened facilities, using decoys, and preparing replacement systems. Even so, more than 80 targets and dozens of boats represented a significant escalation from the limited actions used during earlier confrontations. The geography of the strikes also revealed Washington's priorities. Iranian media reported explosions around Bandar Abbas, Qeshm Island, Sirik, Konarak, Chabahar, Karg Island, and other locations connected to maritime surveillance, military operations, ports, or energy infrastructure. CENTCOM did not publicly confirm every location described in Iranian reports, and Iranian accounts varied over casualties and damage. State media reported injuries from shrapnel near a commercial pier in Sirik and fires involving fishing vessels. Later strikes reportedly affected power supplies in some coastal cities, and Iranian media said a firefighter was killed at an airport in Iran Shar. Washington maintained that it was targeting military capabilities associated with threats to navigation. Tehran accused the United States of striking civilian areas and violating international law. The available evidence does not provide a complete answer for every site. Coastal military facilities are often located close to ports, roads, electrical networks, fishing areas, and civilian communities. A weapon aimed at radar or naval infrastructure can still create effects beyond the intended target. That does not prove deliberate attacks on civilians, but it means civilian risk cannot be separated from an operation of this scale. Washington also applied economic pressure. On July 7th, the U.S. Treasury revoked General License X, which had temporarily authorized the production, sale, delivery, and transportation of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and petrochemicals. The authorization had been one of the most valuable concessions Iran received under the June agreement. It gave Tehran access to international sales revenue after years of sanctions and months of wartime disruption. The replacement license permitted only the wind-down of previously authorized transactions, with a July 17th deadline. No new purchases or loadings were authorized after the revocation. That decision transformed the American response from a military operation into a combined campaign. The message was that attacks on shipping could result not only in destroyed boats and radar systems, but also in the removal of the economic relief Iran needed to stabilize its finances. For Tehran, this strengthened the argument that Washington had violated the agreement before negotiations over a permanent settlement had been completed. For the United States, it was presented as a consequence of Iran failing to provide safe navigation. The disagreement exposes the central weakness of the ceasefire. Both governments accepted language broad enough to stop immediate fighting, but they never reached a shared interpretation of what that language required. Iran's answer was not limited to diplomatic condemnation. Missile and drone warnings were activated in Bahrain and Kuwait, two states that host important American military facilities. Kuwait's defense ministry reported that its air defenses were engaging incoming threats. Bahrain also reported interceptions. Qatar temporarily elevated its security warning before later issuing an all-clear. Iranian authorities described the operation as retaliation for American attacks and claimed that American-linked military sites had been targeted. Some Iranian reporting placed the number of facilities involved at 85, although that figure has not been independently verified and should not be treated as a confirmed damage assessment. Nor is there public evidence that 85 separate facilities were successfully hit. Military statements often count intended targets, launch points, or operational objectives differently from outside observers. What is confirmed is that Iran expanded the confrontation beyond its own coastline and placed U.S. positions inside neighboring Gulf states under direct threat. That alone changed the character of the crisis. Bahrain and Kuwait were not neutral pieces of geography. They were sovereign countries, suddenly forced to intercept weapons because American and Iranian forces were trading attacks. Bahrain is home to the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the naval command responsible for American operations across the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and surrounding waters. Kuwait hosts American air and ground forces and has long served as a logistics hub connecting military operations across the region. By threatening sites in these countries, Iran can impose political costs on Washington's regional presence without attempting to defeat the United States in a conventional battle. Every missile alert creates pressure on host governments. Every interception raises the possibility that falling debris or a malfunctioning weapon could kill civilians. Every strike risks pulling another state deeper into the conflict. This is a familiar element of asymmetric deterrence. Iran cannot eliminate American power from the Gulf through direct military force, but it can try to make the presence of that power more expensive, more dangerous, and less politically acceptable to the governments hosting it. The risk for Tehran is that attacks on Gulf states may push those same governments closer to Washington. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman have different relationships with Iran and different views of American policy. They do not act as a single bloc, but none of them benefits from missiles crossing their airspace, insurance costs rising, ports slowing, or investors questioning regional stability. The political language hardened quickly. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters called the American strikes an act of aggression and warned of severe retaliation. Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, Iran's parliament speaker and a leading negotiator, argued that Washington had broken its commitments and insisted that passage through Hormuz would be reopened only under arrangements determined by Iran. Trump, speaking during the NATO summit in Ankara, said he believed the interim agreement was over and expressed little confidence that a new deal with Tehran would hold. At the same time, he suggested that the confrontation did not necessarily have to return to unlimited war. This apparent contradiction is central to Trump's approach. The language is deliberately forceful, but the possibility of negotiations is not always closed. Military pressure may be used to create bargaining leverage, rather than to replace bargaining entirely. Iran uses a similar method. It threatens retaliation, demonstrates the ability to disrupt navigation, and refuses to surrender its claim to a role in managing the strait, while still communicating through mediators such as Pakistan, Qatar, and Oman. Both governments say the other side understands only pressure. Both also know that a completely uncontrolled war would impose costs neither can easily predict. To understand why the June agreement began collapsing so quickly, it is necessary to examine the wording at the center of the dispute. The 14-point Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, signed on June 17th, declared an end to the war and provided for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Article 5 said commercial traffic would resume, and that Iran would use its best efforts to arrange safe passage without charges for 60 days. Tehran interpreted that language as recognition that Iran had the authority to determine the arrangements governing the entire waterway. Washington and the Gulf states interpreted it differently. In their view, Iran was obligated to facilitate safe passage and could not force vessels onto Iranian-selected routes, demand permission, or threaten ships that used internationally recognized navigation lanes. Both interpretations cannot operate simultaneously. If Iran controls the routes, it gains strategic authority over the movement of global energy. If the waterway is treated as an international strait where commercial ships enjoy transit passage, Iran cannot unilaterally decide which vessels may cross or which route they must follow. The agreement paused the fighting without resolving that contradiction. The dispute is not simply about maps. Iran's coastline dominates the northern side of the strait, and Iranian forces possess missiles, drones, patrol boats, mines, surveillance systems, and shore-based positions capable of threatening traffic. Tehran therefore argues that no practical security arrangement can function without its cooperation. From the Iranian perspective, accepting an American-protected southern route near Oman could allow Washington to establish a permanent security system that excludes Iran from decisions taking place directly outside its coast. It could also reduce Tehran's greatest source of leverage. From the American perspective, allowing Iran to decide which ships may pass would reward the use of force and transform a critical international route into a tool of political coercion. Washington also fears that any Iranian fee or permit system could be used selectively against allies, sanctioned cargoes, or countries refusing Tehran's demands. The argument, therefore, concerns sovereignty, international law, military access, economic power, and the future regional order. A ship's route through a narrow channel becomes a test of which government has the authority to write the rules. The ceasefire was weakened further by unresolved disputes beyond Hormuz. Iran accused Washington of failing to deliver full access to frozen assets. The memorandum called for Iranian funds to become available, but disagreements emerged over who would control the accounts and what Iran would be permitted to purchase. Tehran also cited continued Israeli military action in Lebanon as a violation of the broader arrangement. The United States, meanwhile, accused Iran of attacking commercial vessels and refusing to guarantee toll-free passage through all lanes. The nuclear issue, which helped trigger the war, remained largely deferred to a later negotiating phase. In other words, the agreement did not settle the hardest problems. It placed them inside a 60-day period and assumed that the reduction in violence would create enough trust to negotiate. Instead, every unresolved clause became another reason for one side to accuse the other of acting in bad faith. The timing of the renewed fighting carried another layer of political significance inside Iran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led the Islamic Republic for decades, was killed in the opening U.S.-Israeli strikes on February 28th. His funeral and burial ceremonies took place across Iran and Iraq during the same week that the tanker attacks, American strikes, and Iranian retaliation unfolded. Millions of mourners were presented by the government as evidence of national unity and continuity. The ceremonies culminated in Mashhad, where Khamenei was buried. His successor, Mojtaba Khamenei, initially remained largely outside public view before later appearing through official channels and promising revenge for his father. During a leadership transition, the Iranian state has powerful incentives to avoid appearing weak. The Revolutionary Guards, clerical institutions, parliament, and new supreme leader must reassure supporters that the system remains capable of defending the country. That does not mean every military decision was made purely for domestic reasons. It does mean that accepting American strikes without a visible response would have been politically difficult at precisely the moment the government was trying to display cohesion. Washington faces its own competing pressures. The United States wants to protect commercial navigation, reassure regional partners, deter attacks on American forces, and prevent Iran from converting control of Hormuz into permanent geopolitical leverage. It also wants to avoid an extended campaign that requires ever larger deployments, exposes U.S. bases to continuous missile attacks, increases fuel prices, and creates pressure for ground operations. American air and naval power can destroy visible military assets. It cannot guarantee that every Iranian missile launcher, drone team, mine, fast boat, or concealed command post will be eliminated. Iran's geography favors dispersal. Its coastline is long. Its forces can hide among civilian infrastructure, use underground facilities, relocate mobile weapons, and temporarily reduce their activity until American surveillance patterns change. The United States can impose enormous costs. The difficult question is whether those costs will change Iranian behavior or strengthen Tehran's belief that only continued disruption creates leverage. Iran faces an equally uncomfortable calculation. Attacks on shipping demonstrate power, but they also invite strikes on the very capabilities Iran needs to maintain that power. Closing Hormuz can harm American allies, but it also harms Iran's own exports and weakens countries such as China that purchase Iranian energy. Retaliation can strengthen nationalist support, but sustained conflict can damage ports, electricity networks, military infrastructure, and an economy already under sanctions. Iran's leaders, therefore, need to appear capable of imposing consequences without creating a level of escalation that threatens the survival of the state. That balance becomes harder with every exchange. A missile that is intended as a warning may kill American personnel. An interception may fail. A damaged tanker may spill oil or ignite its cargo. A strike on a coastal radar may hit nearby civilians. Once casualties rise, leaders can lose the political freedom to choose restraint. The economic consequences are already moving beyond government statements. During the first months of the war, the near closure of Hormuz produced what the International Energy Agency described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Flows that had been close to 20 million barrels per day fell to a fraction of that level, forcing Gulf producers to reduce output as storage filled and export routes became unavailable. By June, a fragile recovery had begun. Tankers cautiously returned. Ship-to-ship transfers off Oman allowed cargoes to be moved onto vessels that did not need to enter the Gulf. The June agreement created expectations that more stranded oil could reach international buyers. Those expectations helped bring prices down from the extreme levels reached earlier in the war. The attacks in July reversed part of that confidence. The first tanker attacks pushed oil prices more than 3% higher. The next rounds of American and Iranian strikes produced further volatility. By July 13th, after Trump announced that the United States was reinstating a blockade on Iranian shipping and proposed charging a 20% fee on cargo passing through the strait, oil prices rose more than 5%, with Brent trading around $80 per barrel and U.S. crude above $75. Those prices remained below the peaks reached earlier in the conflict, suggesting that traders had not yet priced in a complete and prolonged closure. But markets were responding to a renewed risk that the recovery might fail. The significance of this is not simply the daily percentage move. Global inventories were already depleted by months of disruption. A second prolonged shutdown would begin from a weaker starting position. Emergency reserves can slow a crisis, but they cannot replace continuous Gulf production indefinitely. Shipping data offered an even clearer warning. On July 13th, Reuters reported that tanker traffic through Hormuz had fallen to its lowest level in 2 months. Available tracking showed only 6 vessels transiting on Sunday, although the true number may have been higher because ships increasingly switched off their public automatic identification system transponders. No LNG carriers were visible crossing during the weekend. Some companies transferred cargo between ships in the Gulf of Oman, allowing receiving tankers to avoid entering the strait. Others delayed voyages or turned away. Switching off tracking can reduce the information available to potential attackers, but it also increases navigational risks in crowded waters. It makes accidents harder to investigate and creates uncertainty for insurers, naval forces, and port authorities. The waterway may be technically open while still becoming commercially unusable for operators unwilling to accept the danger. That difference matters. A government can point to several successful passages and declare that navigation continues. A shipping company must decide whether one cargo, one crew, and one vessel are worth the chance of becoming the next target. Insurance may become one of the most powerful forces in the crisis. War risk premiums increase when underwriters cannot estimate who controls the waterway, which routes are protected, or whether attacks are likely to continue. Higher insurance costs can make a voyage uneconomical, even when no formal blockade exists. Crew members may refuse assignments. Ship owners may demand government guarantees. Ports may face delays as vessels wait for naval escorts or new instructions. Oil and LNG cargoes may be rerouted, but rerouting cannot solve the problem for Gulf exports that physically depend on Hormuz. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have pipelines that bypass part of the strait, yet those systems cannot carry the region's full export volume. Qatar's LNG industry is especially exposed because most of its cargoes must leave through Hormuz. The result is a global supply network in which a relatively small number of missiles, drones, mines, or armed boats can create consequences far larger than their physical cost. By July 12th and 13th, the confrontation had moved beyond the original 3 tanker attacks. Iran declared the strait closed again after accusing another vessel of using an unauthorized route. The Revolutionary Guards said they had stopped ships by disabling their systems, though they did not initially identify the vessels. A container ship suffered an engine room fire after being struck by an unknown projectile. American forces conducted further waves of attacks against Iranian targets, while Iran expanded missile and drone operations against American-linked positions across the Gulf. Trump then announced the return of a blockade on Iranian shipping and argued that the United States should be compensated for securing the waterway. He proposed a fee calculated as 20% of cargo value. The International Maritime Organization objected to compulsory charges in international straits and questioned the legal basis for such a system. The proposal also created an obvious contradiction. Washington had accused Iran of trying to control passage and impose its own arrangements. An American toll system could be portrayed by Tehran as another outside power attempting the same thing. This does not mean the American and Iranian positions are legally identical. International law distinguishes between navigation through international straits, sanctions enforcement, wartime blockades, and security operations. But the political effect is important. Both governments now present themselves as the legitimate guardian of Hormuz. Iran argues that its geography and security responsibilities give it authority over passage. Washington argues that American power is necessary to prevent Iran from coercing global commerce. Gulf states are caught between them, dependent on American protection, but deeply concerned that military competition over the strait may destroy the stability that protection is supposed to provide. The most optimistic scenario is that the current escalation produces a revised agreement. Pakistan, Qatar, Oman, and other intermediaries could negotiate practical rules, separating shipping lanes, establishing communication channels, suspending new attacks, and delaying the most controversial political questions. For that to happen, Iran would need to provide a credible commitment that commercial vessels will not be targeted for using routes Washington considers lawful. The United States would likely need to suspend further strikes and reconsider at least part of the sanctions rollback. Both sides would have to accept language more precise than the June memorandum. A temporary technical arrangement would not solve the nuclear dispute. Frozen assets, Lebanon, sanctions, or the future military balance. It could, however, reduce the chance that a commercial voyage triggers another bombing campaign. A second scenario is a controlled cycle of limited attacks. Iran might continue using drones, small boats, electronic interference, or occasional strikes to demonstrate that it retains leverage. The United States could answer with repeated operations against radars, missile sites, naval facilities, and command networks. Both sides might avoid targets expected to cause mass casualties. This could resemble the conflict around the Red Sea, where shipping continued at reduced levels under persistent threat. The danger is that controlled conflict rarely remains perfectly controlled. Intelligence can be wrong. Weapons can miss. Commanders can misunderstand instructions. A limited strike can kill senior officials or large numbers of personnel and force a response larger than leaders originally intended. A third scenario is a wider regional war. This would become more likely if an Iranian attack killed significant numbers of American troops, if the United States struck Iran's leadership or critical energy infrastructure, if Israel expanded operations, or if Iran activated allied forces across several fronts. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and Jordan could all face increased military pressure. Naval mines could be laid across approaches to Hormuz. Ports and pipelines could become targets. Cyber attacks might disrupt energy networks, banking systems, communications, or shipping logistics. Under those conditions, oil prices would not be the only concern. Food transport, aviation, electricity costs, industrial production, and government finances would all be affected. A fourth possibility is that domestic pressure changes the decisions of one or both governments. Iran's economy has endured sanctions, infrastructure damage, restricted exports, and leadership transition. Continued war could deepen dissatisfaction, but external attack can also strengthen nationalist support and justify tighter internal control. In the United States, rising fuel prices, military casualties, congressional opposition, or public fatigue could limit the administration's freedom to escalate. Trump may believe rapid, overwhelming strikes can force Tehran to retreat without creating another long war. Iran may believe Washington will eventually reduce its demands to avoid continued disruption. Both calculations depend on assumptions about the other side's tolerance for pain. If either assumption is wrong, the crisis can expand before leaders recognize the mistake. What should be watched now is not a single speech or one dramatic explosion. The most important indicators will appear across several systems. Analysts will watch how many tankers enter and leave the strait, whether LNG carriers return, and whether vessels continue switching off their tracking signals. They will monitor Iranian fast boats, coastal missile units, mine-laying activity, radar emissions, and the movement of American aircraft and naval forces. Satellite imagery may reveal whether damaged sites are being repaired, abandoned, or replaced. Governments in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE may change alert levels or evacuate personnel. Mediators may announce a new round of talks. Treasury could modify the oil license again. Iran could clarify whether its declaration that the strait is closed is political language or an operational order to attack unauthorized vessels. Washington could explain whether its proposed cargo fee is a negotiating threat, a wartime policy, or a plan it genuinely intends to enforce. Taken together, the tanker strikes, the American campaign against more than 80 targets, Iran's missile and drone retaliation, the revocation of oil relief, the renewed slowdown in shipping, and the competing claims of control over Hormuz do not yet prove that unlimited war is inevitable. Negotiations still exist. Commercial ships are still finding ways through. Both governments continue to communicate through public statements and intermediaries. But the system that prevented escalation has weakened. The June agreement survived only because each side believed it gained something valuable from restraint. Iran gained economic relief and recognition of a role in arranging passage. The United States gained a reduction in attacks and the reopening of a vital trade route. Once Tehran concluded that Washington was stripping away its benefits, and Washington concluded that Iran was violating the agreement through force, restraint became harder to justify on either side. That is the mechanism through which fragile ceasefires collapse. Not always through one formal declaration, but through a sequence of actions that makes every promise appear worthless. The Strait of Hormuz remains open in the narrowest physical sense. Some vessels are crossing, yet shipping companies are hesitating. Military forces are exchanging fire. Legal authority is contested, and both Washington and Tehran are trying to prove that the other cannot dictate the rules. Tell us in the comments whether you believe a revised agreement can still prevent another full-scale round of war. Because the greatest danger may not be that either government has already decided to begin an unlimited conflict. It may be that both still believe they can escalate one more time without causing one.